One of the most difficult things about this lockdown has been how to separate fact from falsehood. For someone like me who ditched his television over 3 years ago and now rarely buys a newspaper, I have a slightly different perspective to the average Joe. This is not to say that my perspective is any more acute than that average Joe. Since I spend more time than most in my own little echo chamber, my viewpoint is skewed in a different way to those that get the majority of their information from the mainstream. But 5 years ago, my take on things would have been pushed to the outer edges of what could be discussed, what we have come to know as the Overton window. Which is strange in itself, since I don't consider what I believe to be in the least bit controversial. As a 52-year-old white man, I've never wanted to foment revolution. Being on the wrong side of middle age, I've never thought it has ever been up to someone like me to attempt to change society. Fundamentally, I believe in society. I don't consider myself to be any kind of rebel, and nor was I as conceited to think that I am even approaching something as romantic as a maverick. We'd all like to imagine that we are in some way more exceptional than our contemporaries. We all like to think we are Han Solo rather than some drone-like Imperial stormtrooper. The reality is that most of us would like a quiet life to spend with our families in relative comfort and affluence, indulging our interests and hobbies and occasionally exploring some of the wider world. If I'm brutally honest, I've quite enjoyed this lockdown. I've had the time to craft some order out of the chaos that was my garden, and it is now consequently a place in which I can enjoy living that quiet life, luxuriating in its semi-rural paradise. One can be forgiven for thinking that all is right with the world, lounging in the warm May sunshine with the scent of the blooms, the sound of birdsong and the view of the open countryside beyond my post and rail fence, the only problems of which I can conceive are the murders in the Raymond Chandler novels I've been working my way through. This is the world I want to live in, but as in a Hollywood movie, as a cool, gentle breath of wind blows hair across the heroine's face, as a harbinger of trouble to come, there are storm clouds on the horizon. The storm clouds are most obviously the coming recession. This is what the majority of the mainstream commentary will be about. The jobs lost, the collapsed businesses, and the mushrooming national debt. I don't know how true this is, and I can't be bothered to look it up, but somebody recently told me that the deficit has ballooned from £50 billion to 300, a six-fold increase in 2 months. Not being an economist, I can't articulate exactly what it means, but on any metric, it doesn't look good. And the economy is, not to put too fine a point on it, important. Without a healthy economy, there will not be a healthy society. It underpins everything else we have. We've all been encouraged to protect the NHS, but without the money to pay for it, there will be no such thing. But the economy is not everything. It is merely the framework. It's the framework upon which we hang everything else, it's true, but it's still just the framework. The economy pays for our lives, but it's not what makes life worth living. And it's those other things that do make life worth living. The freedom to go anywhere, at any time, on a whim, is definitely one of them. And that is the one that has most conspicuously been denied us. Most of us have dutifully complied. And that's not a small thing, that's a bloody huge thing. And in our willingness to put the common good above our own personal desires, we have demonstrated a selflessness that does us credit. However, the message of selflessness is in serious danger of being willfully misconstrued. We are in danger of broadcasting not our cheerful compliance, but something much more insidious. We are instead in danger of merely broadcasting our weakness. It has been reported that the Prime Minister recently joked, "I've learned that it's much easier to take people's freedoms away than give them back." Many a true word spoken in jest is the phrase that most readily comes to mind. Let's hope it is a joke. Let's hope that that's not what he really thinks. We'd better hope that. For the record, I happen to think that it was a joke. For the record, I think that Boris does value freedom rather highly. And for the record, I'm still just prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt. Boris has repeatedly broadcast his libertarian principles over the years, enough to convince me that he is not a secret totalitarian control freak like Blair or Theresa May. Whether or not he values the liberty of his fellow citizens over and above his own legacy, however, cannot be guaranteed. But having said that, how is it that freedoms get lost when we actually have a libertarian in number 10? Assuming I'm right and that he's what he is. Isn't it paranoia in such circumstances to assume that liberties denied will not be returned to us undiluted? A close friend of mine has suggested as much to me recently, and still another friend thought my objection to a vaccine nonsensical, considering that I'm a recipient of many a childhood immunisation. These friends, two of my closest, have caused me to pause for thought, deep thought. Am I paranoid? Am I being paranoid in rejecting out of hand a curative vaccine being offered by a philanthropic billionaire? Am I being unreasonable in insisting upon my rights, my civil liberties, when many thousands are succumbing to this mysterious super contagious disease that is definitely very deadly for some? But do the restrictions mean that the United Kingdom is no longer a free country? Well, is it? Is it a free country? Well, in essence it is. Of course it is. Of course it's still a free country. It's still a free country in the round, despite the Stalinist incursions into our freedom of speech, with the hate speech laws and the hysterical actions of the Twitter mob. We are still broadly able to say what we like. Not completely, but broadly. But that is quite a distinction. Mostly being able to say what you think is not the same as, well, being able to say what you think. Mostly having freedom of speech is not actually having freedom of speech. All that is being allowed to say what the authorities allow you to say. The one word that none of us are allowed to say, for instance, is the N-word. It makes me nervous enough not to say it, even in this context. It's not a word I ever use, and neither do I have any desire to. And although I'm obviously not entitled to say it, even if I wanted to, actually some of us are allowed. But it is the most taboo of all words for anyone whose ancestors do not come originally from the continent of Africa, who seem to be able to say it, sometimes with relative abandon. But even here we immediately run into problems from people who have mixed African and non-African heritage. Are they allowed to say it? Are they allowed to whisper it, perhaps? Or are they only allowed to say it if it is in the lyrics of a rap song? So at the very first hurdle, the clarity of the word that must not be spoken under any circumstances immediately becomes blurred. So in that respect, in the United Kingdom, that particular speech is not free. And consequently, using the logic that you can't be a little bit pregnant, speech is sadly not free in Britain. But the attack on freedom of speech has been going on for some time, so it can't actually be blamed on the coronavirus pandemic. It's being expanded during the crisis for sure, with the censoring of David Icke and who knows who else for spreading harmful disinformation, but it's only an extension of what has been going on for decades. But the attack on movement, that is new, and judging by the incremental but so far unreversed trajectory of the restrictions on speech, we need to start drawing some lines in the sand right now. With the Coronavirus Act already on the statute books, albeit with a sunset clause, we are already on the back foot. We are in defensive mode. But ground now having already been lost, we need to go on the offensive to get back to the previous status quo, rather than acquiescing to the insidious phrase, the new normal. And it is insidious, because what does the new normal mean? What precisely does it mean? My anti-surveillance antenna got twitching when newspaper columnists started suggesting that we are going to have to accept more monitoring in the future. More monitoring? Why don't they call it what it really is? Surveillance. Unwarranted, invasive state surveillance into our private lives. And anyway, why am I going to have to accept it? Why? Because the manipulated masses say so? Because the hysterical mainstream press will have a hissy fit if I happen to breathe the same air as them? The same press who would have heaped scorn upon the Prime Minister if he'd instigated a lockdown before they'd even thought of it, and then called him a fascist. But because he didn't act like a fascist, and his impulses happened to be against issuing orders to place his compatriots under virtual house arrest, they attack him for being reckless. The bias is so thick you could ladle it on with a spoon. Boris is bad. Boris is a fascist. Oh, hold on. He's been doing the opposite of what a fascist would do. Let's recalculate. Boris is reckless. These morons in the press must think we're idiots. They thought we were idiots over Brexit. And they lost. And now they think we won't notice this pathetic attempt to bring down the elected Prime Minister. The Prime Minister the electorate, and not the press, wanted. And they have the gall to call us COVIDiots. But this isn't the worst of it, not by a long shot. What's worse is the degradation of the very concept of freedom itself. Safety is the paramount value now, it seems. And this elevation of a sensible, prosaic, but not especially noble value has been brought about by the hysterics of the press. So consumed were they to demonise Boris at any cost that they abandoned any pretence at all to the values that they had supposedly previously espoused. Take The Guardian, for instance. They are one of the worst offenders of pushing divisive PC bullshit that has so disfigured our society of late. But even they have had their good moments. It was The Guardian, remember, along with Glenn Greenwald, that published Edward Snowden's revelations. That was a brave thing to do, and they were bullied and intimidated by the British government for doing so. As putrid a publication as it usually is, The Guardian acted quite admirably in that instance, and they were quite entitled to crow about their actions in facing down a government with a serious, genuine and vindictive fascistic streak. But where is that freedom-loving impulse now? Now it's all Boris is weak, Boris is reckless, Boris didn't come down hard enough in obliterating ancient and hard-won rights and freedoms that we have spent decades pretending to defend. He wasn't enough of a fascist in their eyes, which kind of tells you how high a priority the left's ethics are, which appear considerably less important than getting their guy into number 10. Now, this isn't me giving Boris a free pass. He has, I'm sure, made some serious mistakes, which is probably forgivable, and he may well be making more in not admitting them, which is not. But I'm not really concerned about Boris or his legacy. He'll take care of that, I'm sure. But what I'm concerned about is that there seems to be so many people to whom freedom is no big deal, that it's just another tradable luxury that is no longer affordable, like having the freedom to drive a large and luxurious gas-guzzling car. That is something that we can do without, or even something that is somehow selfish to want at all. That is no more important than the economy or education or pensions, and definitely nowhere near as important as health or safety, or that most sacred of sacred cows, the National Health Service. Just think about that for a moment. What's more important, freedom or the NHS? Well, which is it? Now, the NHS is a much loved and valued institution, and it has served us well. It scooped my very own father up after his aorta ruptured, and despite, in the words of the modest and brilliant surgeon who operated on him, being as ill as anyone can be and still be alive, and gave him an extra decade of life. Time that allowed him to see his grandsons grow into fine young men. And I never had to remortgage my house to have that happen. In fact, it never cost me a penny. Well, it did, it cost me my taxes, but I reckon that was a pretty good deal. To all those who have a principled objection to socialised medicine, if we hadn't had it, my dad would have died where he fell. And if he hadn't, I would have had to make the decision to save my dad's life or make my family homeless. But I didn't. I didn't because of the NHS. So I value it. I probably value it more than most. But I don't value it higher than the very concept of freedom itself. Only an idiot would do that. And yet idiots abound in the so-called new normal, would-be slaves that will willingly trade their freedom, and mine, for their pathetic sense of security. To me, freedom cannot be traded. It is so valuable that no price can be attached to it. It is not just precious, it is invaluable. Not even the valuable and much-loved National Health Service can compare. And the NHS is, as we've discussed, very valuable indeed. But compared with liberty, compared with the freedom to say what we like, go where we like, when we like, with whomever we like, to love and to befriend who we like, compared with that, it's nothing. It's nothing at all. It's a very valuable component, like a robust canvas for a galleon's sails. But freedom's the ship itself. But what does it say about a population that cheapens something so obviously precious? What does it say about a society that views safety as the ultimate aim? That to be protected and cosseted is more desirable than to be able to strike out alone? To take the certainty of the sat-nav over the curiosity of, oh, I wonder what's over there? To be told what to do, to save us the anxiety of deciding for ourselves. Are these the impulses of natural adult human beings? Or are they the bleatings of frightened children? And what can you do with children? You can frighten them. And what can you do with frightened children? You can get them to do what you want. You can exploit that fear and get them to do things that they would never do under normal circumstances. You can get them to stay indoors because there is a highly infectious disease outdoors. With a police force of little Hitlers on side, you can get them to denounce their neighbours for exercising more than once a day or not clapping for the NHS at 8 PM on a Thursday night. And most importantly, when they really, really are frightened, you can get them to surrender all those pesky and inconvenient freedoms that are always getting in the way of progress. You can get them to do all these things so long as you promise to protect them. And the great thing about it is that you've never had to resort to crude threats or violence. Get them scared enough, and all you need is an army of self-important little men who've always fantasised about being able to exert power over others, and give them the means to do it. Some of these men, although they're not all men by any means, some of these men are vicious bullies, but most are not. Most are pathetic little Jobsworths who are bequeathed their power by the simple fact of a uniform and a title. And since they are the emotionally stunted kind, they have never believed, and could never believe, in the value of something so real, so precious, but nevertheless so gloriously ethereal as liberty. They are the ones that will take our freedoms away. So, my fellow citizens, fear the Jobsworth, not the jackboot.